4. Brett and Maynard made a careful survey of the area surrounding the cabin. The dogs had been killed, though by precisely what they could not determine. How Scott's killer had gotten in and murdered him was also impossible to figure out, as there were no disturbances of the ground outside his window. Finally, after an hour or so, they gave up the hunt and returned to the cabin. Brett called the field office while Maynard examined the corpse. She now realized something she had previously only noticed subconsciously, that the wounds were not random, but followed a pattern of sorts. There were curved lines emanating from the central puncture in his midsection. At that moment, Brett came in, and she asked him if his impression was the same as hers. "What does this look like to you? Does it look like any symbol?" she asked. He studied the grisly scene carefully, and then said finally, "Yeah, it's kind of like a swastika, isn't it?" "Yes, sort of," she said, cocking her head at the symbol. "I guess maybe he didn't fool his nationalist pals as well as he thought." "Apparently not. Well, I just talked to HQ. Orders remain the same. We'll leave the murder investigation to the local police force and let them report back to us if there's anything material to our mission." "Copy that," she said, and walked out of the room to call the police, while Brett leaned over the body to inspect the strange symbol. As he did so, he made out a very faint buzzing noise in the background. He looked around and noticed on Scott's bedside table a small portable radio. The volume had obviously been turned very far down, but it was still on. Brett moved the switch to bring it into the fully audible range. There was considerable interference, but he could make out an accented female voice reading out the following series of numbers.
17, 63, 6, 3, 88, 13, 77, 23, 17.
The voice would pause, and then repeat this string again. There was sufficient interference that it sounded slightly different every time, almost as if it might be a real person repeating it, but Brett could not be sure. He took note of the frequency, and when Maynard came back they again contacted the field office and the intelligence officer there, Major Blackstone, and told him that Agent Scott had evidently been listening to a numbers station at that frequency. They played the recording for the Major several times. "I'll check it with our people here," he said. "But as far as I know, that should not have been part of his mission. We'll look into it. For now, concern yourselves with completing the assignment." "Copy that." From looking at the material given to them by Agent Scott, they were able to hastily construct a pretty good picture of who the key targets in the area were. There was Paul Gerson, a local preacher who had become involved in the movement through his militant brand of preaching. There was Jack Tonawanda, a mysterious ex-Green Beret who had connections to all sorts of criminals all over the world, and who Scott had thought was amassing a small arms stockpile somewhere. And finally, there was Carrie Knotts, a local celebrity who was always running for one political office or another, claiming to want to oust those in power and restore the country to its founding principles. All of them had gone from being mere reactionary voices to being key elements in the brewing rebellion. They decided to begin with Tonawanda, and it was not difficult, because he came to them the day after Mr. Scott's death became public. Brett and Maynard were posing as friends and reactionary allies of Scott's from out of town. "So, what do you think killed him?" asked Tonawanda, before he had even finished shaking Brett's hand. Brett shook his head. "Would you like a clue?" Tonawanda asked. "Do you mean that you know?" responded Brett. "No, but I know where you should start looking." He handed him a piece of paper with an address on it. "What's this?" Brett asked. "It's an old amusement park on the outskirts of town. The place has been closed up for years. But weird stuff goes on there. All kinds of rumors. Stuff about criminals, superstitions about ghosts, monsters, the whole 9 yards. I was in there one time at night, back when I was working for the police department, and I heard some strange characters moving around and talking. Foreigners, too. They weren't speaking English. Brett nodded. This was the most off-the-wall thing he'd heard yet. What was this lunatic's angle?
And one of these guys' shirts was a symbol. A weird swastika-looking thing like the paper said was on Scott's body.
This got Brett's attention.
So, want to know my theory? I think it's German agents trying to install the Fourth Reich.
Brett nodded politely. It was not precisely clear to him why an ardent reactionary nationalist would consider this a bad thing, but regardless, he didn't buy the theory. Even so, the information was useful to him. He told Maynard what Tonawanda had told him. "It could be a trick," she said. "If he thinks you're onto him as a suspect, he's probably trying to throw you off the trail." "It's entirely possible," Brett admitted. Still, Scott had no indication his buddies were plotting against him, and he was doing a damn fine job blending in. Maybe too fine. "Well, if you want to check the place out, by all means go ahead." It was a cool, gray, misty day when Brett arrived at the closed park. He had swapped out his sniper rifle for a .45 caliber 1911. The decayed park was a rather depressing sight. Once colorful signs and cheerful images faded, broken and collapsing into ruin, as the expendable income available to be spent on such entertainments had dried up in the economic crash of decades past. For all the government's talk of relieving poverty and restoring the heartland of America, the fact was that Agent Brett himself was the most expensive federal government asset ever deployed to this struggling, dreary piece of land that lay along the Ohio River. And unlike a CCC officer, as would have been dispatched in the early 1900s, his mission was not, directly at least, to help the poverty-stricken residents. He moved cautiously through the deserted little park, listening for any sound beyond the gloomy whine of the loose metal swinging desolately in the chill breeze, and the ever-present trickling of water running in streams through dilapidated structures. He felt increasingly ridiculous as he walked alone through this wasteland of carnival tricks and ramshackle remains of machines meant to create some feeling of excitement. And then, underneath the entrance to the Ferris wheel, he saw a little hatchway open slightly and then close just as quickly. He automatically took cover behind one of the old refreshment huts, but there was no further motion. Cautiously, he approached the little hatch, which he realized clearly led into the maintenance tunnels underneath the wheel. The hatch was locked, but he was equipped with a superheated DX-2345 battery energy blade, and he cut open the metal plate in a matter of seconds. He radioed back to Maynard to tell her what he was doing, and she confirmed that she had his position on GPS. "I'm going down into the tunnel. Recon," he said. "Roger that," she said. Inside, the tunnel was a mess of rusted pipes and gears. Brett doubted if the place had ever been properly maintained even before the park was closed. From somewhere deeper in the tunnel, there emanated a faint white light. Brett made his way slowly in its direction, and he too heard foreign voices like those that Tonawanda had described to him. They were speaking in Russian. Cautiously, he pressed himself flush against the tunnel wall and moved slowly towards the light. The voices grew louder, and now Brett could make out that there were three of them. One was very heavy and gravelly, the other two higher and younger sounding. He peeked around a corner, and he could see them in a small alcove. Three tall men in combat fatigues, all seated around a table. Brett ducked back behind the wall, but it was his bad luck that one of the men happened to get up from the table and start coming down the hallway towards him. He was mere meters away. Brett knew there was no way he could remain hidden. So he confidently leapt out from around the corner and drew his pistol. "Halt!" he commanded. "You're under arrest." The man froze, while his comrades in the little alcove reached for the pistols on their belts. "By whose authority?" the man asked in a thick Russian accent. "The United States Central Security Committee," Brett replied calmly. "You two, drop your weapons." "Do as he says," the standing man told them, then turned back to Brett. "Very well, we surrender." Brett was slightly disturbed by how easily his bluff had worked, but showed no sign of it on his face. "All of you in front of me," he commanded. "Keep your hands in the air." He then called Maynard and said, quite matter-of-factly, as if giving the time of day, "Command, this is Delta 1. I've captured 3 tangos. Tell the boys outside to prepare to receive them." There was a silence of perhaps 3 seconds. Then Maynard's voice said simply, "Copy that." Brett slowly marched his captives through the tunnel, trying to move as slowly as he could to buy as much time as possible. He knew he was going to have a problem when he reached the tunnel exit. He couldn't go ahead of them, or they'd probably grab him while his back was turned, and he couldn't let them go ahead of him up the ladder, or they'd most likely see there was no backup. "Halt!" he barked again, and the 3 Russians obeyed. They turned towards him, and Brett knew that if they rushed him, he was going to lose. But just then Brett heard the sound of sirens outside, and knew that reinforcements had arrived after all. He ordered the prisoners up the ladder, and when he emerged behind them, was encouraged to see a large SWAT team armed with MP5s standing in a semicircle around them. Good to see this place still has money for an efficient police force, he thought.